Boker Tov. Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Today's daf yomi is Kiddushin Mem Hey, Kiddushin 45. We're going to start on the bottom of Mem Daled Amud Beis, 6 lines from the bottom. Gemara has said already the Chiddush of Shmuel, which is that if there's a minor girl who became betrothed without her father's consent, we're going to require her to do a get, meaning to say that out of the concern that maybe she is still married, and also we're going to require miyun, which is a rejection of the get, meaning to say rejection of the marriage, so that people don't think that if her husband had betrothed her sister, people might have thought that she was married to the first person, and so therefore the Kiddushin didn't take effect with the sister. So we have to be concerned that maybe the Kiddushin did take effect with the sister. So the sister would also have to get a divorce. And so therefore she requires miyun to make a public statement that I wasn't married. So the Kiddushin did take effect with the sister out of astringency. And so therefore the sister would also require a divorce. That's the position of Shmuel that she requires get and miyun. But Ua, 6 lines from the bottom, says, according to this alternative version of Ua, Amar Ua Katana Sheniskacha Sholodas Avia Afil Miyun Eino Tzricha. That if a minor girl became betrothed without the consent of her father, so that she doesn't even require miyun, meaning to say that Ula is talking about a case where there's nothing going on at all, and she doesn't even require this rejection out of astringency. So meaning to say that the Kiddushin would for sure take effect, and nobody would think it wouldn't, because there was no rejection of the marriage whatsoever. And that's Ula's position, that we're not concerned about the Kiddushin with the girl at all. It doesn't take any effect. So Masa Rav Kahana challenges Ua from the following Mishnah, going back to the very first Mishnah Yevamos, the first half of Yevamos. It says, the Kuan and Mesu, it lists 15 categories of women that if the first husband was married to them, and then he dies, so his wife falls to Yibam because she was related to the brother, to the deceased man's brother, all of her co-wives are exempt from Yibam as well, because she can't marry her husband's brother. And one of those categories is a daughter, because let's say her father married her to her uncle. So then if her uncle dies, she can't do Yibam with his brother, because he's her father. And also in all those cases, the co-wives of her are exempt from Yibam. So Rav Kahana challenges Ua from our Mishnah in Yevamos, because it says V'kuanim Mesu, O Miyanu, or if they rejected the marriage, O Nisgarshu, or they were divorced, O Shenimtu Ailanos, or they were discovered to be, or they were divorced before their husband died, O Shenimtu Ailanos, or the marriage was found to be defective, meaning because, say, she was what's called an ionist, so she wasn't capable of being married. And in all those cases, as long as it happened before the brother died, tsaroseim mutaros. As long as it happened before her husband died, then the co-wives are going to be permitted. Because once the husband dies, she was no longer married to her husband, and so therefore the co-wives are permitted. So the Gemara now says, but what we're talking about, the case of the daughter, the Kid Shaman, who was the one who betrothed this daughter, which allowed her to reject the marriage, because it says if she did miyun, then she was no longer married. So the Kid Shaman, he made the Kid Shavia. If you want to say her father married her off the miyun sagi, well, it wouldn't be sufficient for her to just do miyun, which is a rejection of the marriage. If her father married her off, it's a total marriage. Get ma'aliyah by, she would require a complete divorce. So it must be alav the kachi nafshi. It must be that she betrothed herself. And still the Katani, and still the Mishnah says, to buy miyun, that she requires the rejection of the marriage. So this is therefore is a rejection of Ua, says if she betrothed herself, then she doesn't even require miyun. So that was the question Rav Kahana asked. He asked the question, he answered it. What we're talking about is going shenasala ma'isi yisomim b'chayav. No, we're talking about a case where why do we say that miyun happens here? Because her father had already married her off once. And so once the father marries her off once, he doesn't have the right to marry her off again. But rabbinically, we say she can marry her off. She can marry herself off the second time, or through her brother, or through her mother. This is what's called the Maisi Som Chayav. Rashi says, father married her off, and she became widowed or divorced while she's still a minor. So her father's still alive, but she's like an orphan. That since her father that since she became married once, her father no longer has jurisdiction over her. And so therefore, if she, and so then she betrothed herself to her father's brother. The Hani Kiddushin, that this betrothal requires miyun, because she doesn't have to wait for the consent of her father. And by miyun alone, it's sufficient. It's only rabbinically allowed. And so therefore, the rabbis did it. Says Tosfos, says Rashi, the rabbis allowed her to do in this circumstance. But this is not the case that we've been talking about, where a minor did it without the consent of her father. In this case, we're looking at her father as though he's no longer legally there, because she's a Yisoma B'chaya Av, because her father had already married her off once. So Matzav Rav Hamnuna again challenges Ua, because it says, Ein Mochro Akrovim, that this is a case from the Brisa, that the Brisa says that the father is not allowed to sell her off to relatives. We learned the halacha of a father selling off his daughter, and the man who acquires her has the right to marry her as well. That's called yiyud. But since the Torah gives the right to marry her, according to the Brisa, the first position of the Brisa, he can't sell her off to a relative because the relative can't marry her. It has to be capable of being married. But Mishum Rabbi Elazar, Amru Mochel Kruvim. Rabbi Elazar allows the father to marry her off, to sell her off to relatives, even though they can't marry her. This is called obviously dealing with a minor, because the father can't sell an adult daughter, only a minor daughter, on top of 45a. Vishavin, but both Rebbe Elazar and Tanakama agree, Shemochra almana l'kohen gadol and grusha v'chalutz l'kohen hezhut. But they both agree that he could sell a girl who's a widow to the kohen gadol, and a grusha and a chalutza, divorcee, to a regular kohen, even though they can't marry her. But since if they did marry her, the marriage would take effect. Therefore, even the Elazar agrees that, even the Tanakhama agrees that he could sell her to those people. So the Gemara says, let's analyze it, let's break it down. What's the situation here where there is a girl who's a widow, whose the father is selling her off? If we're saying that the father had already betrothed her once and she became a widow, from that Erison, Mimatzi Mizabin law, has the father really have the right to sell her? Does the father really have the right to sell her after that? After he sold her off once and after he betrothed her once and she became a widow? Once he marries her off, he can't sell her off as a slave after that. Once he betroths her, he can no longer go back and sell her off. That's the halacha. Alav, it must be the Kaddish nafsha. Must be that we're talking about cases where she betrothed herself, the Kikari la almana, and yet we still call her a widow. And we see from here that this is a question against Ua, because we see that if she betrothed herself, it takes effect. So Amarav Yitzchak, no. Here what we're talking about is the Kiddusha Yiyud. He had sold her off the first time, but then the person he sold her to became betrothed to her with the same money that he had given her the first time. He then transferred that initial payment into a betrothal money. V'alibud Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda, who says Maros Harishonos V'avol Kiddushin, knew that the first money was not for Kiddushin, and nevertheless, she moved into the betrothal state. He married her afterwards, so she's called a widow. So he didn't initially betroth her, but she became married through Yiyud. So look at Rashi. Rashi explains how this happened. Rashi says, B'kiddushay Yiyud, shenis almana mikidushay Yiyud. She became a widow after the betrothal had happened through Yiyud, which is where the slave becomes married to the master. V'im tomar halo al yidei avia ba'ula ba'avlei mochar le'ishus v'shuv eno mochar le'shiflis. And if you want to say, but it happened through her father, and he has sold her to be a wife, and so therefore he can't sell her again to be a slave. Hamasnisa liba de Rabbi Yossi. So you say this price, it goes going to the position of Rabbi Yossi, who says the most harishonos, the initial money that the father received for the sale, wasn't given for Kiddushin, but was given for shiflus. The yiyud shetofas b'machmas shepoches prutos, pu'ula sheyeshu aleh uba. And then the yiyud, the marriage that he takes for her, comes as a result of diminishing, as basically in exchange for the work that she no longer has to do for him. It's not coming through the father to her. So therefore it's going to be allowed. So this is a different case also. That's the point. So now the Gemara says, Itmar. So the Gemara teaches us some halachos. The Gemara hasn't really disproved Ula's position or proved Shmuel's position. The Gemara says, let's teach some halachos here. Itmar meis v'nafla achev l'yibam. So let's say in a circumstance where somebody betroths a minor girl without the consent of her father. Remember, Shmuel says she requires get and miyun, and Ula says she doesn't even require miyun. So let's say this person who betrothed a minor girl without the consent of her father dies, and now she falls to his brother for yibum. So now Rav Huna teaches us halacha in the name of Rav. Remember, Rav is going to be like Shmuel. Rav says mima enes maro. She has to do miyun if the brother who survived, i.e. the yavam, if he did mamar, which is rabbinic kiddushin with her, she has to do mima enes for that. Ve'ena mima enes lezikaso. But if she just had a zika with him, meaning if he didn't do mimer, she doesn't have to do miyun. So Rashi says, Tzricha miyun im get hamutal alaha. She requires a miyun with the get. Im asa b'maimer also a get matzricha lios imo miyun. If she did mimer, then that get also that she requires as a result of the mimer, she requires miyun. Ve'enam mamenas lezikaso. But if he didn't do mimer with her, so therefore he has no get upon her, only chalitza to her, then that chalitza does not require miyun with the chalitza. And now he's going to explain his position. So that's what he says. So Amar Rav mima enes l'mamar, Rav eno mima menes l'zikaso. How so? Ketzad. Also b'maimer, let's say he did maimer with her. Tzricha get, v'tzricha chalitza, v'tzricha miyun. He's going to require a get because of the maimer, and he's going to require a chalitza, and he's going to require miyun. And the Gemara explains it. Tzricha get, he requires a get. Shema nisratza b'kedusha sheni. Maybe the father was out of the concern that maybe the father approved of the mimer of the second betrothal, and so therefore it was okay, and so therefore maybe it's acceptable, maybe it's okay, and so therefore maybe it was a vow marriage, so therefore he requires a get from that. But tzricha chalitza, he requires also chalitza. Shema nisratza b'kedusha risho. Maybe the father only approved of the first marriage, and so therefore, since maybe the father only approved of the first marriage, now she falls to him for chalitza because he did mimer with her, or because he didn't do mimer with her, and it's going to require chalitza to release her from that. And tzricha miyun, and she also requires miyun. Shema lo nisratza v'lo b'kedusha rishon v'lo b'kedusha sheni. Maybe the father didn't approve of either one. The yomru, and then people will say, "Oh, he can't marry her sister." In Kiddushin Tosim Achosa, that he can't marry her sister. So it requires miyun to say that if you did do Kiddushin with the sister, you need to give her a divorce. Lo asabel mimer, but if he didn't do mimer with her, eina tzricha el chalitza bavad. Then, if he didn't do mimer, then the second husband only has to require chalitza. So why? Because he didn't do mimer with her, so we don't have to be concerned that he would give her a get, but he has to do chalitza. Maybe the father approves the first one. And ma'im amres, and when we say tibayna miyun, maybe you should say, okay, she requires also miyun, so that in case he marries her sister, Shema Yomru Ein Kiddushin Tovsim Achosa, that's not a concern. Why? Akol Yodim, because everybody knows Achos Chalutza, that in that case she'll be the sister of her of a Chalutza. Everybody knows that whole prohibition is only Rabbanan. Everybody knows that's only a rabbinic prohibition. So here we have the rabbinic concern, the Gzera Miyun, and we wouldn't apply that onto a rabbinic prohibition. Now the Gemara tells us several stories. There were two men who were drinking together some wine. They were having a drink. They were drinking it either under, Rashi gives two explanations. Maybe they were drinking it under like a willow tree, or maybe they were just sitting on some mats, shooting the breeze, and they were drinking some wine. Shakal chamina ukasa the chamer. One of them takes a cup of wine. You have little chaver. He gives it to his buddy, and Amar mikdashli bartei. He says, I want you to betroth your daughter to my son. So here the difference is he's betrothing the daughter through the father. Fine, the father has the right to do that, but to his son, where does he have the right to betroth his son? So even according to the position of Rab and Shmuel, that we have to be concerned that maybe the father consented and therefore he requires a get and a miyun. There, we say maybe the father consented. We're here on the top of 45b. But Shemin Esrat Ben. But here in this case, we don't have to be concerned that the first man who is betrothing said, "I'm betrothing your daughter to my son." Who has a son here? Shemin Esrat Ben. Maybe the son agrees. Lo Amrinan. There we don't have to say it. So therefore, she doesn't require, even according to Rav and Shmuel, she wouldn't require anything here. So on top of Memei and Beis, Ramalei Rabbano Ravina V'Dilma Shliach Shavia. Maybe the son had appointed his father an agent and told him, go find me a wife and marry her for me. So he says, Lo chatzaf inish l'shavia la'avu ha'shliach. Nobody would be so disrespectful as to appoint their father to be their agent, to go out and be the agent to acquire the wife. The Gemara says, V'dilma artzuya artzei. But maybe what happened was the son told his father that he really wants to marry this woman, and so therefore the father was acting on his behalf, even though it was inexplicit. So the Gemara says, "Amalei Rav Bar Shimon beferish Amar Delo Savar Laha the Rav Shmuel." So he says no. That the reason why Ravina said this is because we have explicit teaching that he doesn't agree with Rav and Shmuel, and he says that in the case of where a girl married without the consent of her father, that it doesn't require miyun, and also in this case that unless we heard explicitly, he can't do it for his son, and so therefore he doesn't require anything. Well, now we have a similar case. There was a man who betrothed a minor girl without her father's consent in the marketplace with like some vegetables. He took like maybe a cucumber, I don't know. So Amar Avina, Amar Choshishin Shemin Esrat. So even according to Rav and Shmuel, say we have to be concerned that maybe the father would have wanted and therefore required get him miyun. Hani nili derech kavod. That's only if you betrothed this minor in a very honorable way. Avol derech bizayon. Well, but if you did it in a disrespectful manner, it would not be acceptable. Demai, because what we have to be. So the Gemara says bizayon demai. So Amalei Ravachami Dipto Ravina. How is it a disrespect? Bizayon demai. Ibizayon de yarka. Ibizayon de shuka. Was it the disrespect of the vegetable that he betrothed her in this disrespectful manner, or was it the disrespect of doing it in the marketplace? And nafkamina, and the distinction would be the kaddish bekaspa b'shukah. Let's say betrothed her with money in the market, or bekisha the yarka, or a bebeta, or betrothed her with the vegetable, with the parsley in his house. So what would be the law there? Both of them were considered to be disrespectful. And if he did either one, if he betrothed the minor with like just a piece of parsley, a piece of celery, or he betrothed her in the marketplace, even Rav Shmuel would say you don't have to be concerned about anything. So now we have another case. Ahuda Amar with Krivai. So there was a husband and wife. One said, I want her daughter to marry my relatives. She says, I want her to marry my relatives. Kafte Ada Amarati Havil Kreva. She kept pressuring him until he said, okay, we can marry your relatives. She can marry your relatives. So they made a big party. While they're eating and drinking, then the husband's relatives came upon the roof, and he married the daughter, betrothed her. So Amar Abaye says, so basically Abaye is saying, even according to Rav and Shmuel, we don't have to be concerned about anything here. Sheres Yisrael lo yasu avla. The husband wouldn't have made a party with as a lie, basically. He's not going to lie. And so therefore, if the father is not going to be a liar. So therefore, we have the assumption that he wasn't lying, and we don't have to be concerned that maybe the father wants this betrothal because he would never have recanted what he initially said, and so therefore the betrothal of his relative doesn't take effect. Rava says, so that's the position of Abaye. Rava says, Chazaka ina adam torach besuda mafsida. I have a different reason why the marriage is not valid. Because the presumption is a man isn't going to engage in a meal and make a big party for no reason. So if he's making a big party for his daughter to marry his wife's relative, we don't have to be concerned if his relative came along. My benayu, he could be out to a Let's say he didn't do anything for the meal. So according to Abaye, since he initially said you can marry your relatives, therefore he never would have recanted. But according to Rava, he would have. We don't believe everybody is telling the truth, and they might have recanted. So now we have another scenario. Let's say she became betrothed with her father's consent, and then the father travels out of state. And she stands up and she gets fully married. Amarav, so Rav says, under those circumstances, Ochelas betruma. If she's fully married, she can eat from the truma. And so now Rav is saying that under these circumstances, since we don't know if the father objects, she can eat from the truma until her father comes v'yimcha and reject it. Presumably, obviously she's married to a Kohen, and even though she didn't have this slip according to the position of the father, and the Rabbanan say, like we did in Ksubos, that the woman cannot eat from the truma until she gets fully married because of either we're chai shino a simpon, or we're either concerned that he's going to find a blemish on her once they're married, and then retroactively it wouldn't be a marriage, or else we're concerned that while she's living in the home of her father, she would give the truma to her brother. But here she went ahead and got fully married, and so the Rabbanan, according to this position, recognizes this, that Rav is saying she could eat truma because since he allowed the Kiddushin, we're going to assume that the chuppah was also good for him until we hear that he didn't want it. Whereas Rav Asi says, Eino chelas. Rav Asi says she can't eat from the truma. Why? Shema yavo avia v'yimcha. Let's say, lest the father come and object. If the father would say, I didn't want her to get married, and then he has the right to cancel the wedding, and then she's been eating truma when she wasn't supposed to. Have a uvda, there was a circumstance, there was a circumstance where the father went overseas, the girl got fully married, and Rav said, you know what? I'm going to pass in like Rav Asi to be stringent, and she can't eat from the truma. Amar Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak umoda Rav, but Rav would admit shemesa that if she died, eno yorsha, we're not going to allow the husband to inherit her. Uki memona b'cheskas mare, because we're going to say no until you prove that the father consented. We're going to say keep the money in the same presumptive status it was beforehand. But let's say we have this other case, Niskat Shaladas, Venises Shaloladas, Vaviakan. The previous case where she got married without the consent of her father, where she got fully married, then soon without the consent of her father was overseas. But let's say her father's in town. So Rav Huna says, Eino Chel. Rav Huna says, well, in that case she can't eat. Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba says she can eat from the truma. Funa Amar Eino Chel, she can't eat from the truma. According to Rav, even though Rav says the Amar Ochelos, Rav says when he goes overseas, she can eat Hasam Hudulo Iselav, because there the father is not there to object. Avohacha the Iselav, Hai the Ishtik, Mirsach Rasach. So Rav Huna says in that case the father went overseas. So Rav says therefore he can eat. But in this case, from the fact that he's still here and he doesn't say anything, we're assuming that he's going to be upset, and that's why he can't eat. The idea is that's why she can't eat, because mirsach rasach. The reason why he's quiet is because he's so upset. But if he was consenting, then he would have said something. So that's what Rav Huna's position is. Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba says, Ochelas, afilo Rav Asi. Even Rav Asi would allow her to eat from the truma immediately if the father was in town. Because afilo Rav Asi, even though Rav Asi says if he goes overseas, she can't eat. Because maybe the father will come and object. From the fact that he's quiet, it's obviously that he agrees. This gotcha shalo, third case. Let's say she became betrothed without the consent and then fully married without the consent. Kan Rav Huna Amar Vaviakan, and the father's in town. Rafuna Amar Ochelas, Rav Yirmiyah Barabba Amar Enochel. So Rafuna says in this case she can eat, and Rav Yirmiyah Barabba says she can't eat. And so if the father is in town, she got betrothed without his consent and married without his consent, we're going to allow her to eat the truma. So Amar Ula Adar Rafuna Kechometz L'Shinayim U'Ka'asham Einayim. This is like vinegar for the teeth. Rav Huna's position that she can eat if she got the betrothal and the marriage in town, and like smoke in the eyes. Ha shomah the Kiddushin d'oraisa. When it's a case where the father consented to the betrothal, and the father was in town, you said for the chuppah, you said she still can't eat from the truma. For sure. In this case, she shouldn't be allowed to eat. The father didn't even consent to the Kiddushin. How could she eat from the truma? Near in Divrei Talmud, he says, I'm going to agree with the position not of Rav Huna, but Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba. So that's what Ua is saying. So Amar Rava, no. Rava says, my time of the Rav Huna. No, what's the reason why Rav Huna says in this case, where she got the betrothal and the full marriage without the consent of the father, she can eat? The reason is because since she became betrothed and she married herself while her father was still alive without his consent, it's like she was an orphan because he saw this and was quiet. Or maybe he abandoned his rights that he had for her, meaning to say after he didn't object anything after the betrothal, he gave up all his rights. Meaning to say if she became betrothed with his consent and then she got married without his consent, you could say that maybe by one, if he's silent one time, then maybe he's upset. But Kulei Hai Lo Shasik, Rashi says he wouldn't be quiet both times, so he's abandoning her while she's still alive. He's waiving his rights. And so therefore she's like an orphan, and so that she had the rights to do it, and so therefore, in this case, Rav Huna would say she can eat from the truma. We'll go on, I'll stop the recording here, but we can continue.